The second speaker this afternoon is Dan Bucsescu, who is a professor, as everyone knows here, has taught at Pratt for a very long time, since 1980, and holds an architecture degree from an Institute of Architecture in Bucharest, Romania, and a B.Arch from the City College of New York. He also received an MS in architectural psychology at the University of Surrey in England. So he's been teaching at Pratt for a long time, and some of you have no doubt taken him in courses. And he's the one, of course, who put together this conference out of a great curiosity about neuroscience, as many of us share for different reasons in a way. And I think that Dan will talk probably about, he's already talked a little bit about his reasons this morning, but it will probably come up in your talk also now. So that would be, I think that's great. Okay, so welcome.
Might as well begin while they setting me up here. I'm a practicing architect, part-time academic, and I've read a few books about neuroscience. So my interest in my short talk is to focus on students and on the education. I'll explain that in a moment, but it's more parochial. The conversation so far have gone to the high level of philosophy of science, and nevertheless, the topic of how we teach, you began to address that question. It's centered to my personal interest. In my talk, I will present some ideas I have had about how to organize an architectural core curriculum in the light of some readings from biology and from cognitive psychology. So what am I? Okay, I should also tell you that I prepared the talk as if I was talking to students. Quite often, not to my colleagues, but I hope to interest them as well. Most of the time, half of the students don't speak English. So I've gotten to the habit of putting the text on the slide and reading it. It helps me make sure that they connect the visual and the audio, as well as it helps me time my talk. So what are the problems, as I should state in the beginning, I'm trying to solve? I'd like to push back at the academic theoretical climate of distrust of the architect's creative will, and I'll document that a bit. And the other point is, from my observation, the student's passivity in design, being taught that the role of the designer is data mining. Okay, which one? Not yet, not yet. No, this is, okay, thank you. You've been keeping me in check all these months. Student passivity in the design, being taught the role of the designer is data mining. There is a confusion in the way we use the word research and design, and I'll make a brief comment on that. It's quite fashionable these days to say that design is research. And yes, design is partially research in the beginning phases, but research, if I humbly would suggest, is an open-ended process of one question leads to more questions to better questions. So it ends up with a multiplicity of possibilities. Design is an act of closure. You're moving from many to one, from many possibilities to only one actually built reality. If I go to a client and I say, well, I could make the bricks this way and that way, vertical, horizontal, whatever, ultimately I have to choose between those. I'm not going to ask him which one you like and are you happy with which. That's possibly, I will. But in the end, a design is an act of closure. You constantly go, this, not that. So it's, in a way, it doesn't have the same spirit as research. Be this as it may, of course research and design are intimately linked. So, but this leads to, the data mining notion leads the students to postpone making decisions, say, well, the data will tell me which way to go. And finally, the problem that I will speak a little more at the end is the lack of integration in the curriculum, where a student is constantly lacking certain kinds of knowledge that are supposed to arrive in the design studio from the support courses. Now I'll start. Okay. My talk will touch on 3 topics. Is this the one? Well, it doesn't matter. Okay. Not 1. What is the problem with the idea of purpose? 2. What is consciousness? I suggest that what we teach is architectural consciousnness. But in the way, I looked at neuroscience to inform us on that topic, and to philosophy as well. What is consciousness as described by my own non-scientific research and by neuroscientists. They say consciousness is embodied, epigenetic, plastic, and goal-oriented. 3, the education of an architectural consciousness in 3 years. I will propose an idealized vision of the core curriculum for an architectural education based on lessons from 2 writers, a biologist and a neuroscientist. The goal is to achieve a high degree of horizontal coordination of all knowledge from supporting courses required in the design process. I will try to show how the dynamic core model of consciousness and its characteristics as envisioned by Gerald Edelman, whose name came up this morning, can be applied to an architectural core curriculum. Of course, from my position as an architect, I only speak metaphorically. The application is an analogy. All right. So in 1984, while I was teaching first year, the daughter of friends of mine had a car accident, had a head injury, and was in coma for 6 weeks. And then afterwards, she went through 3 months of rehabilitation where she relearned all her spatial skills. I had a little bit of Piaget way back in my graduate school, and I was curious to understand how they are retraining her basic spatial skills. And also I said, well, why isn't that similar to what I'm trying to do with first-year students? Relearn about cognition of space. But in the end, I went to visit her about 2 weeks after she came home, and I asked her a question. This is my naive way of entering the topic of consciousness is, what were the first moments of consciousness when you moved from coma to consciousness? And here is what she said.
Yeah. I don't know who was bothering me. And I was sort of always making pacts with the devil and deals with God, and I was always thinking, okay, if I can remember, it was like orange and green and blue and white stripes, like bright white stripes, and I remember I kept thinking, well, if I can remember what colors the stripes are tomorrow, then God will let me out of purgatory or hell, whatever it is.
What's happening here? There we go. By the way, this is my drawing imagining what the curtains were. Let's read again because it may have gone very fast. Let's see what she said. When I first broke into reality, I was for a while fading in and out of coma. I remembered the curtains around my bed, the contrasting blue, green, and orange vertical stripes were disturbing under the bright fluorescent lights. I was always making pacts with the devil and deals with God. If tomorrow I can remember what colors and the order of the stripes were, then God would release me from the purgatory. Well, Miss D told me in 1984 what 15 years later I found in Edelman's theory of neurodarwinism. That's a quote. In primary consciousness, this self exists in a remembered present, reflecting the integration of a scene around a small interval of time present. In fact, at that time I said, my God. Also, I don't think I could find a better definition of architecture as an act of attribution of meaning to form. Miss D's first moment of consciousness matches the phenomenological approach which has been so influential in architectural theory for a generation. I got this from Don Hyde, who at the time was, 20 years ago, was the chair of phenomenology at Stony Brook. There are two different strategies for interpretation, the phenomenological and the hermeneutic. One, phenomenological strategy. Instructions of how to look rely on certain knowledge of the mechanisms of perception. The subject is seen as an active perceiver. The hermeneutic strategy, the use of story or fable devices in order to create an immediate thought context to aid memory. The story creates a condition that immediately sediments the perceptual possibility. What is this? I don't have the time to test it on the audience, but the answer would be it is a thin, black, wiggly line on a white background. Well, this is a phenomenological description of a found reality. Its aim is not to interpret perception, just describe it as best we can without preconception. That was ultimately the end of phenomenological movement. The hermeneutical strategy. It's a bird to the bird watcher. An ongoing hand glider to a high-tech teenager. Upward buttocks and breasts to a Freudian. Two hills for a geographer. In short, it tells us the subject of the perceiver brings a context. So you guys at ANFA ask subjects, tell me, are you more comfortable in curved environments or straight environment? I find that too reductive because I think both you have to take in consideration the intentions of the designer as well who the user is. All right, so let's quickly go to what I found from a moment of consciousness as described by neuroscience. In particular, I liked her slides, I must say. Susan Greenfield, she suggests that it resembles a ripple in a lake when you throw a stone. These are some slides from YouTube, so I picked them up. I should have asked her for permission, but you won't tell on me. But basically, and again, this is, remember, I'm speaking as if I'm presenting to students, so I apologize for the neuroscientists in the room. But the formation of neural assemblies is a ripple, the moment on a stimulus, in this case, this kid putting hand on fire. It produces an assembly of neurons. And she dares to talk about consciousness because I found a great deal of reluctance on hardcore neuroscientists to use the word consciousness. In fact, I should tell you that in the beginning of her talk, she apologized for the word consciousness because she said that it's, from a scientific point of view, is not formalizable. But let's look quickly at this, what is on the slide. Obviously, what it depends on, the neuronal assembly size, the degree of sensory stimulation, I guess how hot the fire is, that refers to it, the extent of associations, formation of competing assembly, if it's competing for attention, arousal, availability of modulator. What are modulators? I'll let you guys tell me, but the availability of other modulators, the hormones. You know, I barely grasp these things. But the other modulator, what if you had a drink before that modulates your perceptions, I assume. What is interesting that in fact it changed my idea of what consciousness is. It's a split second. It's 250 milliseconds. You know, when we talk about consciousness, we think that it's the state of mind, of religious interpretation, of being in touch with the universe, of being aware. But in fact, in their definition, it's a very, very brief moment. This is one of her slides, which she constantly asks the question, but can neural assemblies be linked to consciousness? And this is a basic question, but she was very careful on qualifying her use of the term. Let's go now to another experience. As a student, a long time ago, I fell in love with this quote from Darwin's writings. Let an architect be compelled to build an edifice with uncut stones, fallen from a precipice. The shape of each fragment may be called accidental, yet the shape of each has been determined by the force of gravity, the nature of the rock, and the slope of the precipice, events and circumstances, all of which depend on natural laws. But there is no relation between these laws and the purpose for which each fragment is used by the builder. He did that in, by the way, I don't know how I found it. I won't claim that I've read Darwin. Somehow I stumbled on this quote, and I liked it a lot because it seemed to justify, it allows a purpose to enter evolution. Okay. So what's the problem with intentionality? Or with the idea of an architect designer as an individual agent of will? I personally have a problem when I define design as willful imposition of order. I'm a dinosaur, philosophically. In a recently published book, The Psychopathologies of Cognitive Capitalism, we read, Franco Berardi, I guess, writes, the infinite proliferation of information flows unleashed by the acceleration network technology has made impossible conscious elaboration of information by the individual agent of will. Closer to architecture, the problem was best stated by my colleague, the next speaker, Michael Eng. About 4 years ago, or more longer, we organized a conference here at Pratt, short in the summer. The school was closed, so nobody heard about it, about intentionality. And he said it well. The architect is now viewed simply as a facilitator or organizer of the relation of historical, material, and technological forces. Postmodern practice emphasizes the contingency of historical and material conditions that serve to position the figure of the architect as the product of the design process, not the leader. Again, there are several dangers, he writes, to taking up an extreme position with respect to these issues, such as the wholesale denial of any agency and therefore responsibility on the behalf of the architect. Well, we have a word, and his name came up as well. In fact, the word sculpture, we received from, I learned about it, and I think Ralph too, from in Harry's book, but he quotes Warren Nidich. How do you pronounce it? Nidich? Nidich? Okay. Offers a more hopeful note for the possibility of artistic intention and gives a liberating definition of sculpting neurological maps in the brain of architects and non-architects. In an essay titled Art Power, Resistance is Fertile, he writes, artists, using their own materials, practices, histories, critiques, spaces, and apparatuses can create alternative distributions of sensibility or redistributions of sensibility that call out to different populations of neurons in neural maps, potentially producing different neurological architectures. All right, so that's kind of the solution. What is the problem of intentionality? It seems that architects are very much mistrusted. The design process should be transparent, should be democratic, and all models of the black box of the mystery of the genius architect is out of fashion. Well, I agree with that by and large. 100 years later, Darwin, a French biologist, after Darwin, the French biologist Jacques Monod poses the question: what are the more general properties that characterize living beings and which distinguish them from the rest of the material world? The answer is suggests the notion of teleonomy, or purpose. What I'm going to quickly try to condense in 5 minutes, his argument. This comes from his first chapter entitled Strange Objects, Chance and Necessity, an essay on natural philosophy and modern biology. Monod sets up the story. What criteria a Martian, upon arriving on Earth, would use to distinguish between natural and artificial objects? These are the things that the Martian examines on Earth: a house, a sand cave in Utah, a crystal, a quartz crystal, a hive, a beehive, the bee itself, a bunch of horses running in a field, cars on a highway, the human eye, and a camera. He found 3 criteria: teleonomy, of purpose, autonomous morphogenesis, and reproductive invariance. In a few minutes, I will give the definition that he gives to those 3 terms. But let me follow quickly his argument. A rock, a mountain, a river or a cloud, a cave. These are natural objects. A house, a car, a knife, a handkerchief. These are artificial objects, artifacts. Analyze these judgments, however, and it will be seen that they are neither immediate nor strictly objective. Wholly ignorant of the nature of such beings and of the projects, they might have such beings and the projects they might have conceived. Our Martian would have to utilize only very general criteria, solely based on the examined object, structure and form, and without any reference to their eventual function. The suitable criteria we see would be 2 in number: regularity and repetition. The objects selected for examination would be of macroscopic dimensions, but not microscopic. That is very important. On the macroscopic scale, one would be dealing with atomic and molecular structures whose simple and repetitive geometries obviously would attend not to a conscious and rational intention, but to the laws of chemistry. The Martian then examined some pebbles near which we discover some quartz crystals, let's say. According to the same criteria, he should, of course, decide that while the pebbles are natural, the quartz crystals are artificial objects. An error which moreover proceeds from an interesting source. If the crystals present perfectly defined geometrical shapes, that is because their macroscopic structure directly reflects the simple and repetitive microscopic structure of the atoms or molecules constituting them. If the Martian looks at the house in the cave at the submolecular level, it will find sand crystals, so you could not tell the difference. But let's suppose that the Martian is now studying altogether another kind of object, a hive built by wild bees, for example. The Martian would obviously find all the signs indicating artificial origin, the simple and repeated geometrical structures of the honeycombs and the cells composing them. What are we to make of this confusion, Monod asks. We know that the hive is artificial insofar as it represents the product of an activities of bees. But we have good reasons for thinking that this activity is strictly automatic and immediate, but not consciously projective. A bee, if the Martian now inspects not the hive, but the bees themselves, it cannot take them for anything but artificial, highly elaborated objects. The Martian will note that the extreme complexity of their structure, the number and position of abdominal hairs, is reproduced with extraordinary fidelity from one individual bee to the next. Powerful evidence, is it not, that these creatures are products of a deliberate, constructive, and highly sophisticated order of activity. And what if the Martians attempt to analyze the structure of the performance of two series of objects, horses running in the field and cars moving on the highway? The analysis would tend to the conclusion that these objects are closely comparable, those making up each series having a built-in capacity for swift movement, although over different surfaces, which accounts for the differences of structure. So let's go to the next one. And if, to take another example, we were to ask the Martian to compare the structure and performance of an eye of a vertebrate with that of a camera, the Martian would have to acknowledge their profound similarities. Lenses, diaphragm, shutter, light-sensitive pigments, surely the same components could not have been introduced into both objects except with the view to getting similar performances from them. Monod goes on to point to an epistemological contradiction in our understanding of nature. The notion that objects made by humans exhibit the clear intention or purpose that gave rise to their production is paradoxical to Monod, since no intention or purpose can be attributed to nature. He calls them strange objects. Nature, according to the scientific model, is objective and purposeless. This epistemological contradiction has caused a great deal of confusion in architectural discourse in general, in educational models employed in architecture school in particular. I think the word strange objects, Latour also talks about that everything is hybrid between material and culture. But I don't have the time to go there yet, and I barely understand it. But in any case, Monod's original question was, what are the more general properties that characterize living beings and which distinguish them from the rest of the material world? Here are the definitions of the three criteria Monod found. Teleonomy, the project which gives rise to an artifact, implies the subjective idea of an intention. Every artifact is a product made by a living being through which it expresses in a particularly conspicuous manner one of the fundamental characteristics common to all beings, all living beings, without exception, that of being objects endowed with a purpose or a project. All structures, all performances, all activities contributing to the success of the essential project will hence be called teleonomic. Autonomous morphogenesis. We have downstairs for 20 years part of the curriculum called morphology. Okay. Spontaneous structuration as a mechanism that owes almost nothing to the action of outside forces, but everything from its overall shape down to its tiniest detail to morphogenetic interaction within the object itself. A structure giving proof of an autonomous determinism, precise, rigorous, implying a virtually total freedom with respect to outside agents or conditions, which are capable, to be sure, of impending this development, but not governing or guiding it, not of prescribing its organizational scheme to the living objects. Bottom-up emerges. I think in design, one of the big questions is forces bottom-up design and top-down design, but maybe we have time, we can talk about that later in the discussion. Reproductive invariance, that's the third. And this is a biological term. We have to keep in mind reading this. All of this is Monod's definitions. The ability to reproduce and to transmit without variation the rich body of information corresponding to their own structure. This information is preserved intact from one generation to the next. I suggest, that was I'd like you guys to tell me if I'm entitled to take that term from the biology and go to suggest the biological term can be applied to cultural evolution. The term has come up here earlier this morning. And cultural, including the concept of meme, which is also quite, I like the term. I'd like to, others have problems with it. Memes, the source is from The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. The new cultural replicators. Cultural transmission, although not the same as genetic transmission, which is basically conservative, can give rise to a form of coevolution with natural evolution. Language and all other tools for survival seem to evolve by non-genetic means and at a rate which is orders of magnitude faster than genetic evolution. Everybody tells us that our technology has moved much faster than our brains. And then maybe the problem is we haven't evolved so as quickly as technology, but that's another larger topic. An idea meme might be defined as an entity that is capable of being transmitted from one brain to another. Wow, this is kind of a scary thought. And from one generation to the other. Examples of memes are tunes, ideas, catchphrases, clothes fashions, ways of making pots, and building arches, as well as folding paper or making drawings. What is the problem we're trying to solve in the core curriculum? I would argue integration of knowledge and individual creative purpose. I will propose a map of the complex geography of skills, manual and cognitive, and the supporting knowledge, both in terms of their sequence and timing, that must be available and usable by students in their design studio project. In that task, I suggest a useful analogy between an architectural core curriculum, and it's not just an accident of the word core to core, which maybe there is something into it, I will admit, but that will be way too thin ice to skate on. But in any case, core curriculum and dynamic core hypothesis from Edelman. I must tell you that I haven't read much, but in the 80s I stumbled on Edelman, and he wrote for popular consumption, and I was one of the consumer of his of his writing. The book is A Universe of Consciousness: How Matter Becomes Imagination. What a great title. Such properties as integration and differentiation fit well and are applicable to the structure and diversity of element in the mind of an architect. Edelman suggests, again, as a naive consumer of neuroscience, I'm attracted to their metaphors, visual metaphors. Edelman suggests that spiral galaxy is a good visual metaphor for the moment of consciousness. That's it out of his book, and that text I'll read in a moment. So then I got myself an image from Google about the galaxy. So here is what he writes. No visual metaphor can capture the properties of a dynamic core, and a galaxy with complicated, fuzzy borders may be as good as any other. As explained in the text, the integration of large amount of information over fractions of a second requires a highly integrated yet differentiated organization that, as far as we know, is found only in certain brains. So this is what I did, design at the center, and here is a list of all the courses that are surrounding the design studio. I'll start with material structure techniques, program development, writing skills, professional ethics, assembly systems, building codes, zoning codes, model making, freehand drawing, digital media, geometry, biology, and neuroscience. For your sake, I put it in there. It wasn't there last year. Okay. The model of consciousness we get from neuroscience is one of And those are the properties that Edelman, I chose only 2 out of the 7. He writes, integration or unity, a fundamental property of the conscious experience is that it is integrated. A conscious scene cannot be decomposed into independent components. Number 2, and that's the one, distribution of information, context dependency, and global access. A system is complex if the mutual information between any subset and the rest is high, that is, if consequences of change in the activity of any subset of elements are sufficiently distributed to the rest of the system. The sensitivity to context is the other side of the coin. So the terms that attracted me on thinking about the task of designing a curriculum are context dependency, global access, and so on. By the way, I found the same good quote in Michael's book, A.Arbib, How the Brain Got Language. He writes, however, the brain is not a set of different boxes, each doing a separate job. Rather, multiple regions compete and cooperate, making their own specialized contribution to a range of cognitive function. Michael, you could help me explain what that means. I have a vague idea. Did you write that? Or? Okay, but the other thing I did with using Monod's 3 criteria, I thought, well, why don't I use them to organize the curriculum? So teleonomy is the act of living in the moment and exercising purpose. Autonomous morphogenesis are the technical courses. In a moment, I'll go a little more detail. Reproductive invariance is architectural and cultural history. About a year ago, when the curriculum committee, I think we were all talking about organizing the curriculum, and that's the result. I think the Meredith will remember that, and probably Erica will remember that discussion. So I used, the first circle is autonomous morphogenesis, bottom-up causality. The second one is teleonomy, purpose, intention, lived experience of design. This is the lived experience of design. And the third one is reproductive invariance, cultural memory, received knowledge that's top down. And then I also used Popper. Karl Popper was influential early in my head, and he organized the whole thing in 3. World 1 is the world of physical objects, spontaneous structuration, necessity, determinism, laws of nature, brain synapses. World 2, biopolitics, I think is Meredith's term. Is that correct? But, or anyway, consciousness and sentience. That's what Popper's term. A search for identity. Those are mine. I put them there as describing subjective conflict, economic competition. World 3 is the culture of ideas. Recorded works of culture. That's what Popper's word for the third world is. Architecture, art, the theories of science, language, laws, dominant paradigms, memes, history of technology. Okay. So then my task was, how do I take the courses and I plug them in these 3? So here it is, and probably we can have a discussion later on if they belong there or not, or some of them overlap. But techniques, structures, materials, assembly systems, building environments, ecology, and neuroscience. This is the end. I think that the brain is just as much a material condition of the life of an architect as is using bricks in a way. Somehow it is, it belongs there, I believe. Next, in the design studio, you have all the projects, first year, second year, third year, and so on. I don't have to detail that, but I think I'd like to go here. What courses belong in this circle? Architecture and art history, representational media, professional practice, zoning, building codes, etc. Liberal arts courses, social studies, literature, critical studies, world civilization. Okay. And then there are those parts of the diagram. You know, if you're an obsessive diagram maker, you get to fill in those things. And I think there will be things that are, the thought is that those 2 circles feed into the present time, into here. So here it is. I think that From the experience of the material world, we get sense of time, of space, sense data, perception, materials. That's what we get from there. Here, the mathematics, geometry, cognition, and technology, those are cultural concepts. So, the reason I put them here, because that's an interesting question. Is mathematics, humans found mathematics in nature, or is simply one of our inventions and seem to work for us? I tend to think that mathematics is a human invention that seems to work and help predictability. So, and technology. And then what's the last one? I don't know how I'm doing time, but I'm very near the end. I have another minute. Yeah, how about a minute?
Yeah,
just finish. What do we get from the world 3? We get norms, not laws, but norms, maybe, okay. Social practice, programs, memes, tools, and codes. All right. How could we achieve such a complex knowledge of integration and purposeful design behavior in our students? The design studio is a big integrator of project-specific relevant information. So I'm repeating those properties that I read earlier. I won't, for the sake of, I don't have to read them again. A moment of architectural consciousness, then, must exhibit 3 properties. But that is quite often not possible in the way the curriculum works today. In the first year, there should be only 1 project ending in partial full scale of installation. I think the students should learn from a line of on paper or from folding paper, the impact of that event has to complete with full scale, maybe in a cave, or maybe in a full scale installation. But the student has to realize the completion of the arc. Okay, that's number 1. So it's hard to do, but we do a lot of full scale installations in here, and they should build it. Okay. And the second one is, the problem is that if in second year a student is given a kindergarten, and the kindergarten has to use reinforced concrete, well, all of a sudden the student is a 4th year student, he gets materials in 3rd or 4th year. So there is also, I think the information from supporting courses have to feed in, and they are meaningful in the process of when the student is interested or needs that information. Maybe in the future, with all the other support courses, will be online, and the student at each time is faced with the need to understand something in the design will go online and retrieve it. And survey courses are not relevant. If you're doing a kindergarten, you take a liberal art course in Introduction to Psychology, you may not hear a lot about children's psychology or learning theories. So that information has to be integrated and arrive at the student's desk in the design studio at once to achieve this kind of distribution of information, context dependency, and global access. Thank you.